Great empires have vanished from the earth without a clear reason. Across the globe, ancient societies that built monumental cities and mastered their environments suddenly collapsed, leaving behind only ruins and riddles. Today we are exploring 30 of the most baffling ancient environmental disasters, events that scientists still cannot fully explain. This journey is not just about the past, it is a deep dive into mysteries that hold critical lessons for our own modern world. You will discover how climate change and resource pressures shattered powerful civilizations and why their ultimate fates remain hotly debated. What forgotten catastrophe do you think could have brought down an entire empire around the year 1200 before the Common Era? The civilized world simply fell apart. In a shockingly short span of time, the grand palaces of the Mycenaean Greeks were burned and abandoned. The mighty Hittite Empire in Anatolia vanished from history. Even Egypt, a powerhouse for millennia, barely managed to fight off invasions from mysterious groups they called the Sea Peoples. This was the late Bronze Age collapse, a catastrophic event that erased entire societies from the map and sent the Mediterranean into a dark age that lasted for centuries. So what could possibly cause such a widespread and simultaneous failure? The evidence points not to a single enemy, but to a perfect storm of environmental disasters. Tree ring and sediment core studies reveal a period of severe, prolonged drought that would have crippled agriculture for generations. This drought led to widespread famine, destabilizing populations and making them desperate. There is also tantalizing evidence from ice cores in Greenland that suggest a massive volcanic eruption around this time, possibly Hekla 3 in Iceland, which would have spewed ash into the atmosphere, blotted out the sun, and caused years of volcanic winter, further destroying crops. This combination of events would have been too much for even the most advanced empires to bear. Their complex, interconnected economies, dependent on trade and stable harvests, shattered under the strain. The exact sequence of events and their relative importance, however, is what fuels intense debate today. Was it the drought that started it, making kingdoms vulnerable to invasion? Or was it a volcanic winter that delivered the final blow? No single explanation fully accounts for the sheer scale and speed of this civilizational reset, leaving the late Bronze Age collapse as one of history's most profound and enduring mysteries. Centuries before the Bronze Age fell, another empire, the very first the world had ever known, met a similar fate under a relentless sky. The Akkadian Empire, which had unified the fractious city-states of Mesopotamia, did not fall to a rival army. Its end is written not in broken weapons, but in a layer of sterile dust. At the ancient site of Tel Leilan in modern-day Syria, archaeologists made a startling discovery. They found a thick, uniform layer of wind-blown silt that contained no signs of human habitation whatsoever. This barren earth marked a sudden, catastrophic break in the historical record, a period of abandonment that lasted for nearly 300 years. The empire's northern breadbasket was simply erased from the map. What could cause such a complete and utter desertion? The evidence points to a climate catastrophe of staggering proportions. A severe drought, one that may have lasted for multiple centuries, gripped the region. This was not merely a few bad harvests, it was a fundamental shift in the climate itself, a desiccation so complete it turned fertile plains into barren wasteland. One compelling theory suggests this megadrought was triggered by a massive volcanic eruption, perhaps from Aniakchak in Alaska. Such an eruption would have filled the atmosphere with reflective aerosols, creating a volcanic winter that disrupted rainfall patterns across the globe and effectively turned off the rain over Mesopotamia for generations. The social consequences were apocalyptic. Without water, the intricate irrigation systems that sustained Akkadian power were useless. The northern cities were abandoned entirely, their populations scattering in a desperate struggle for survival. This led to mass migration southward, placing immense pressure on the remaining cities and shattering the empire's economic and political structure. the world's first empire was ultimately brought to its knees not by human enemies but by a change in the weather. Yet the exact mechanism that could lock a region into such a profound and prolonged drought remains one of the great unresolved puzzles of ancient climatology. Far to the west of the crumbling empires, a different kind of cataclysm was brewing, one born not from a lack of rain but from the Earth's explosive fury. The volcanic island of Thera, now the beautiful crescent of Santorini, was a ticking time bomb. Around the year 1600 before the Common Era, it detonated in what was likely one of the most violent volcanic eruptions in the last 10,000 years. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. The entire center of the island collapsed into a seething magma chamber, creating the vast caldera we see today. The explosion would have been heard across continents, and the ash plume soared miles into the stratosphere, darkening skies across the eastern Mediterranean. But the immediate physical devastation came from the sea. The sudden collapse of the volcano into the water would have generated tsunamis of almost unimaginable power. Waves hundreds of feet high would have radiated outward, taking mere hours to reach the shores of Crete, the heart of the sophisticated Minoan civilization. These walls of water would have scoured the northern coast of Crete, obliterating ports, smashing the Minoan fleet, and flooding the fertile coastal plains with salt water, rendering them useless for agriculture. The vibrant palace of Knossos, though it survived the initial waves, would have faced a broken world. The mystery that captivates archaeologists today is not the power of the eruption, but its precise role in the Minoan decline. Was this single event the knockout punch for Minoan society, or was it a devastating blow that merely accelerated a decline already in motion from other factors, like internal strife or economic competition? The debate hinges on a critical, unresolved question: the exact date of the eruption. Radiocarbon dating of an olive branch buried in the ash points to a date around 1600 before the Common Era. However, archaeological evidence from Egypt linked to the well-established timelines of the pharaohs suggests a slightly later date. This discrepancy of several decades is everything. If the eruption happened earlier, it could have directly toppled the Minoans, leaving a power vacuum for others to fill. If it happened later, the Minoans may have already been weakened, and the eruption was simply the final, tragic act of a civilization already fading. So we are left with a haunting image of a magnificent culture confronting a force of nature beyond all comprehension, and a single question that a few decades of time could answer: did the Earth itself deliver the killing blow, or did it just finish the job? The same forces that shattered the Mediterranean world also reached across an ocean, toppling a civilization of unparalleled sophistication in the Americas. Deep in the jungles of Central America, the great Maya cities of the Classic period were abandoned in a wave of collapse between the 8th and 9th centuries. This was not a single event, but a slow, chilling unraveling. One by one, the vibrant heartlands of Maya civilization fell silent. The grand stone plazas where crowds once gathered were reclaimed by the forest, and the intricate calendars carved into their monuments simply stopped. For centuries, the jungle kept their secrets, leaving modern archaeologists with a haunting question: what could cause such a brilliant and powerful culture to simply walk away from its greatest achievements? The answer appears to be written in the layers of lake beds and cave formations. Paleoclimatologists have drilled into sediments from lakes like Chichen Canab in Mexico, analyzing the chemical composition of the mud. What they found was startling evidence of a series of extreme, multi-decade megadroughts that struck right at the time of the collapse. These were not mere dry spells. They were profound rainfall failures that would have caused catastrophic crop loss, especially for maize, the cornerstone of the Maya diet. You can picture the reservoirs, the lifeblood of these sprawling cities, slowly evaporating under a relentless sun. Famine would have spread, followed by social chaos. The Maya kings, who derived their power from a claimed ability to communicate with the gods and bring rain, would have seen their authority completely undermined. When the prayers failed and the rain still did not come, the social contract between the ruler and the ruled would have shattered. Yet, this seemingly straightforward environmental explanation is complicated by a very inconvenient truth: the collapse was not universal. While the magnificent cities in the southern lowlands, like Tikal and Kapon, were deserted, other Maya centers in the northern Yucatan, such as Chichen Itza, not only survived but entered a period of new prosperity. This stark regional difference is the core of the mystery. If a uniform climate event like a megadrought was the sole culprit, why did it doom one region while sparing another? This paradox forces us to consider that the environment may have been the trigger, but the gun was already loaded by political and social factors. Perhaps the southern cities were more densely populated, putting a greater strain on their local resources and making them more vulnerable to a bad harvest. Maybe their political systems were more rigid and fragile, unable to adapt to the crisis, while the northern states had more flexible forms of governance or better water management strategies, like tapping into vast natural sinkholes called cenotes. The puzzle of the Maya collapse, therefore, is not a simple story of a civilization killed by drought. It is a far more complex and unsettling tale of how environmental disaster can interact with pre-existing social weaknesses. The real question is not what killed the southern cities, but what allowed the northern ones to endure, a mystery locked deep within the wet mud of ancient lakebeds and the dry stones of abandoned pyramids. While the Maya faced a crisis of rain, another great civilization was confronting the opposite problem: a world vanishing beneath the waves of a shifting river. The Indus Valley civilization, also known as the Harappan culture, was a marvel of the ancient world. Its cities, like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, boasted the world's first sophisticated urban sanitation systems, with standardized bricks and intricate street grids that rivaled anything in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Yet around 1900 before the Common Era, this vast, interconnected society, which spanned over 1 million square kilometers, began to crumble. Its great cities were slowly, systematically abandoned. The question of why this remarkably advanced and seemingly peaceful culture disappeared is one of archaeology's most stubborn puzzles, made infinitely more difficult because we cannot read their script. Their voice is silent, leaving only the physical ruins to tell a cryptic tale. The most compelling clues point to a dramatic transformation of their lifeblood, the river system. The civilization was built around the mighty Gagga-Hakra River, a watercourse that once flowed year-round through the heart of their territory. Geological and satellite imagery reveals that this river was not a myth. It was a major Himalayan-fed river, likely a tributary of the Great Indus. But the evidence shows that around the time of the decline, this river underwent a catastrophic change. It began to shift its course dramatically, a process that may have been triggered by tectonic activity or changes in the monsoon patterns. Some theories suggest a series of colossal, civilization-breaking floods forced the river onto a new path, scouring the landscape and destroying the agricultural base. Others argue for a more gradual but equally deadly process. The river simply dried up, turning from a reliable source of water into a seasonal stream, and then into a dusty ghost of its former self. Imagine the slow, creeping dread as the central artery of your entire world simply withers away. The consequences would have been apocalyptic. Agriculture would have collapsed without a reliable water source for irrigation. The intricate trade routes that connected the cities, which depended on river transport, would have disintegrated. This would have shattered the economic unity that held the civilization together, forcing populations to disperse into smaller, isolated villages simply to survive. Yet, the river theory is not the only suspect. There is no clear evidence of a single cataclysmic invasion or war, and the cities show little signs of widespread violent destruction. This has led to other hypotheses, including the possibility that a prolonged drought, similar to those that afflicted other civilizations, also played a role here, compounding the river's betrayal. The ultimate enigma, however, is the script. With over 4,000 inscribed objects recovered, the Indus Valley script remains undeciphered. It is the locked diary of this entire civilization. Without it, we are left guessing. Did their leaders record warnings about the changing river? Did they write prayers for rain or chronicles of a great flood? We simply do not know. The disappearance of the Indus Valley civilization therefore stands as a uniquely profound mystery, a reminder that even the most brilliantly engineered cities are ultimately at the mercy of the environment, and that the loss of a single voice can silence the story of an entire world. The silence of the Indus Valley is echoed by the iconic stone faces of another island world. Easter Island stands as a global symbol of a society that allegedly destroyed its own environment. The traditional story is a stark and simple cautionary tale. A Polynesian people arrived on a lush, palm-covered island and flourished, carving the massive Moai statues as expressions of their power and faith. Over centuries, they cut down every last tree to move these stone giants and to clear land for farming. The ecological collapse was swift and brutal. Without trees to anchor the soil and build canoes for fishing, society descended into warfare, famine, and cannibalism, leaving the population a tiny fraction of its former size by the time Europeans arrived. The evidence for this narrative seems compelling. Pollen samples taken from lake sediments show a dramatic decline in the island's signature palm trees, coinciding with the peak of Moai construction. The land, stripped of its forest, became eroded and less fertile. It is a powerful story of human hubris and self-inflicted ruin. But is it the whole story? Recent archaeological findings have begun to unravel this tidy narrative, revealing a far more complex and tragic sequence of events. One major complication comes in a very small package: the Polynesian rat. These rodents, which arrived with the first settlers, had no natural predators on the island. They would have feasted on the nuts of the palm trees, preventing the forest from regenerating long before the last tree was ever felled by human hands. The deforestation, therefore, might not have been a deliberate act of ecological vandalism, but a slow-moving disaster accelerated by an invasive species the people could not control. Even more critically, the idea of a total societal collapse before European contact is now being seriously questioned. When the Dutch explorer Jacob Roggeveen first landed on Easter Sunday in 1722, he did not describe a barren wasteland of starving survivors. His logs note a population of several thousand people living in a functioning, if somewhat stressed, society. The true death knell for Rapa Nui was likely the arrival of Europeans themselves. Subsequent visits by Spanish and British ships introduced diseases to which the islanders had no immunity. Then came the slave raids of the 1860s, which kidnapped or killed thousands, devastating the social fabric beyond repair. So the debate now rages: did the Rapa Nui people truly engineer their own ecocide through reckless short-sightedness? Or were they a resilient society managing a fragile environment, only to be ultimately destroyed by forces entirely beyond their control? The Moai do not answer, their stoic gazes fixed on a horizon that witnessed a mystery far more tangled than we once believed. Across the Mississippi River from modern-day St. Louis, a city once thrived that rivaled any in medieval Europe. Cahokia was the beating heart of a vast civilization, a sprawling metropolis that at its peak around 1100 CE was home to as many as 20,000 people. Its skyline was dominated by enormous earthen mounds, including the colossal Monk's Mound, a structure that still stands today, larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. This was a center of trade, ceremony, and political power, a testament to the ingenuity of the Mississippian people. Yet by the year 1350, this great city was completely abandoned, its grand plazas empty and its purpose forgotten. So what could cause the collapse of such a dominant and sophisticated society? The answer seems to be written in the mud of the Mississippi floodplain. Sediment cores extracted from nearby lakes and oxbows tell a story of environmental turmoil. They reveal distinct layers of sand and silt, evidence of catastrophic floods that would have repeatedly swamped the low-lying city, destroying homes, submerging the vital agricultural fields that fed the population, and contaminating freshwater supplies. Imagine the chaos of watching the river that gives you life suddenly rise up to take everything you have built, not just once, but again and again. Compounding this, tree ring data from the region also points to periods of severe drought that would have struck between these flooding events. This cruel climatic 1-2 punch, a cycle of deluge and desiccation, would have pushed Cahokia's agricultural system to the breaking point. How can you plan for the future when your fields are either underwater or turning to dust? Such relentless environmental stress would have inevitably frayed the social fabric. The ruling class, whose authority was likely tied to their perceived ability to ensure prosperity and communicate with the spirit world, would have lost all credibility when the rains and rivers refused to cooperate. This could have sparked internal rebellions, violent power struggles, or a simple, profound loss of faith in the entire social order. Yet, the mystery deepens because the environmental evidence is not clear-cut enough to be the sole culprit. Some researchers argue that while floods and droughts were severe, a resilient society might have found ways to adapt. This has led to other compelling theories. Perhaps the city's very success sowed the seeds of its own destruction, with a dense population depleting local resources like timber and game, leading to a slow-burn ecological crisis. Or maybe social unrest, fueled by inequality and the failures of the elites, caused the civilization to simply unravel from within, leading people to vote with their feet and disperse back into smaller, more sustainable communities. The ultimate fate of Cahokia's people remains one of the great unanswered questions. They did not vanish from the earth, but their grand political experiment collapsed. Did they simply choose to walk away from a city that the environment had made impossible to sustain? The silent mounds hold their secret, a reminder that even the most powerful societies are in a constant, delicate negotiation with the world around them. The fate of Cahokia's mounds is mirrored by a different kind of ghost story, one written in the frozen soil of the high Arctic. For nearly 500 years, 2 Norse settlements thrived on the western coast of Greenland, a remote European outpost at the very edge of the known world. These were not just small camps, but full-fledged communities with churches, a cathedral, and hundreds of farmsteads, all established during a period of unusually warm climate known as the medieval warm period. Then they vanished. By the middle of the 15th century, the eastern and western settlements were silent, their fate a chilling mystery. The answer seems straightforward, a dramatic climatic shift into a period we now call the Little Ice Age. As temperatures plummeted across the North Atlantic, the growing seasons in Greenland shortened drastically. The pastures that had once supported cattle and sheep were choked by persistent cold, and the sea lanes back to Iceland and Norway became increasingly treacherous, blocked by vast expanses of pack ice that isolated the colonies for years at a time. This environmental squeeze should have been a challenge to overcome, not a death sentence, and that is the core of the enduring puzzle. The Norse were not the only people living in Greenland. The Thule Inuit, ancestors of the modern Inuit, thrived in the very same conditions that doomed the Norse. The Inuit were masters of their environment, hunting seals and whales from flexible kayaks and umiaks, using every part of the animal for food, fuel, and clothing. The Norse, by contrast, remained culturally and economically rigid. Their identity was tied to being European Christians and farmers. They clung to a pastoral lifestyle centered on livestock, a practice that became increasingly unsustainable as the meadows failed. They continued to build churches with imported timber while their own resources dwindled. they showed little evidence of adopting the survival techniques of the Inuit, such as hunting ringed seals through the sea ice in winter, the most reliable food source available. Why did they fail to adapt? This is the question that haunts every analysis of their collapse. Was it cultural pride, a refusal to learn from those they may have considered inferior? Was it a deepening religious orthodoxy that interpreted their suffering as a test from God, one to be endured rather than solved through innovation? Or was it simply that by the time the need for change became desperate, they were already too weakened by malnutrition and isolation to make the radical shift? The archaeological record offers no signs of a single catastrophic event, no mass grave suggesting a final battle or plague. Instead, it tells a slower, sadder story of a people gradually starving, of farms being abandoned one by one as the cold tightened its grip. The last written record of them is a marriage contract from the early 15th century, a fragment of normal life in a world that was already closing in. The ultimate fate of the Greenland Norse remains one of history's most poignant warnings about the danger of inflexibility. They possessed the knowledge and the neighbors to survive, yet they disappeared, leaving behind only stone ruins and a haunting question: what does it take for a society to choose change when its old way of life is literally freezing to death? The Greenlanders' struggle against a changing climate finds a haunting parallel in the sweltering jungles of Southeast Asia. The Angkorian Empire, with its magnificent capital at Angkor, was a powerhouse sustained by water. Its kings were not just rulers, they were divine hydrologists who commanded a staggering network of canals, reservoirs, and intricate moats. This vast hydraulic system was the empire's lifeblood, allowing it to support a population of perhaps 1 million people and to produce enough rice to fuel its expansion. For centuries, this engineered landscape seemed to tame the monsoon, turning its seasonal deluges into a controlled source of prosperity. Then, something went catastrophically wrong. The system that had built the empire may have been the very instrument of its undoing. The evidence for this hydraulic breakdown is not found in ruined temples alone, but deep within the mud of the city's central reservoir, the West Barre. Scientists have extracted long sediment cores from these ancient waterways, and the layers of silt tell a story of dramatic climate chaos. They reveal a period in the 14th and 15th centuries marked by wild swings between extreme weather events. First, there would be a prolonged, severe drought that drastically lowered the water levels in the reservoirs. Then, without warning, the skies would open, delivering an intense monsoon rain that the weakened and half-empty system could not handle. You can visualize this cycle of failure. A long drought would leave the canals choked with silt and the reservoirs parched. When the violent rains finally arrived, the compromised system would be overwhelmed. Instead of being channeled neatly into the fields, the water would have surged through the canals, causing catastrophic flooding and eroding the very foundations of the city's infrastructure. The intricate balance was shattered. This environmental whiplash would have had devastating consequences. The rice paddies would have been destroyed by floodwaters after years of being starved by drought. Famine would have spread, and the authority of the god kings who had promised to control the waters would have evaporated as quickly as the monsoon rains. Yet, piecing together the exact sequence of events that led to Angkor's final decline remains a monumental challenge for archaeologists. Was it a single 100-year megadrought that delivered the final blow? Or was it a slower process where each climate shock weakened the social and political structure, making the empire vulnerable to other pressures like shifting trade routes or the rise of rival powers? The sediment cores give us the timeline of the environmental disaster, but they cannot tell us the human story of how the Khmer people responded. Did they try to adapt their failing system, or was the collapse so swift that they had no choice but to gradually abandon their magnificent capital to the relentless jungle? The true mystery of Angkor is not that it fell, but how its greatest strength became its most profound weakness. Even the most desperate pleas for help can echo unanswered across centuries. Among the most haunting artifacts from the ancient world are clay tablets from the Hittite capital of Hattusa, inscribed with urgent messages to the pharaoh of Egypt. They are not declarations of war, but desperate requests for shipments of grain. This was the reality for one of the Bronze Age's superpowers in its final days. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries and rivaled Egypt itself, was starving to death. So what could bring a militaristic empire to its knees, not with a sword but with an empty bowl? The evidence points overwhelmingly to a prolonged and severe drought that crippled their agricultural heartland. This was not a single bad harvest, but a systemic, multi-year failure of the rains. The empire's central plateau, the engine of its economy, simply stopped producing enough food to sustain its population, its bureaucracy, and most critically, its massive army. The mystery deepens when you consider the Hittites' resilience. This was an empire that had survived invasions, internal rebellions, and shifting alliances for generations. They were masters of fortification and military strategy. Why then could they not overcome this environmental challenge? The answer may lie in the very structure of their power. The Hittite state was a highly centralized, top-heavy system. Everything from food distribution to military logistics was controlled by the royal administration in Hattusa. A prolonged famine would have shattered this centralized control. Local governors, unable to feed their own people, would have stopped sending taxes and troops to the capital. The army, the ultimate enforcer of imperial will, would have disintegrated as soldiers deserted to find food for their families. This created a death spiral. A weakened central authority could no longer protect trade routes, leading to economic isolation. This isolation made the famine even worse, as they could not easily import food from allies despite those heartbreaking pleas to Egypt. Some scholars argue this was not just a Hittite problem, but a symptom of a general systems collapse that gripped the entire eastern Mediterranean. In this view, the Hittites were like one giant domino in a chain. Their famine weakened them, making them vulnerable to both internal fracture and external threats, such as the migrating sea peoples and resurgent smaller kingdoms on their borders. Their collapse was so complete because every system that propped up their society, from agriculture to international trade to political loyalty, failed at once. The true puzzle is why this particular drought was the trigger. What made it different from the dry spells they had undoubtedly survived before? Was it simply longer and more intense, or had the empire, through population growth and resource depletion, become so brittle that even a moderate shock could break it? The silent ruins of Hattusa offer no answer, leaving us to wonder if any empire, no matter how powerful, is ever more than a few failed reigns away from oblivion. High in the thin air of the Andes, a civilization that mastered the impossible was brought low by a vanishing resource. The Tiwanaku state, a sophisticated pre-Incan culture that flourished around the vast expanse of Lake Titicaca, collapsed around 1,000 years ago. This was not a society easily intimidated by its environment. They built a capital city from monumental stone and, most remarkably, developed an ingenious agricultural system known as raised fields. These were vast, elevated planting platforms surrounded by canals of water from the lake. This brilliant method protected crops from frost, recycled nutrient-rich silt, and created a microclimate that allowed them to grow potatoes and quinoa at an altitude where farming should have been unthinkable. For centuries, this system turned the harsh altiplano into a breadbasket, supporting a powerful state with influence stretching across the southern Andes. Then the rain stopped. Paleoclimatologists have drilled deep into the lakebed of Lake Titicaca itself, extracting long cores of sediment. The layers of mud act as a climate archive, and they reveal a devastating truth. Starting around the year 1000 of the Common Era, the region was gripped by a megadrought so severe it may have lasted for several centuries. the lake level plummeted, dropping by dozens of feet. You can picture the canals between the raised fields, the very arteries of their agricultural heart, slowly turning to dry, cracked earth. Without this water, the frost protection and nutrient cycles failed completely. The fields that had once sustained an empire would have withered, leaving a sprawling population facing famine. This presents a profound puzzle. The Tiwanaku were arguably one of the most adaptive societies we have ever seen. They engineered a solution to one of the world's most difficult farming environments. So why could they not adapt to this new, drier reality? The answer may lie in the very success of their system. Their raised field agriculture was a masterpiece of engineering, but it was also rigid and entirely dependent on a specific, stable water level in Lake Titicaca. When the climate shifted so dramatically and permanently, their entire agricultural model became obsolete. They could not simply move their fields. The infrastructure was fixed to the landscape. There was no backup plan for a world where the lake itself was retreating. The social consequences were inevitable. As famine took hold, the authority of the elite and the religious leaders, who derived their power from a claimed connection to the gods of rain and fertility, would have evaporated. The unifying economic and cultural power of the capital city fragmented. People abandoned the urban centers and dispersed into smaller, isolated communities in more sheltered valleys, reverting to a simpler, more sustainable way of life. The state did not fall in a single battle. It dissolved, its political and economic power scattering to the winds. The mystery of Tiwanaku is not one of a sudden catastrophe, but of a slow, inexorable drying. It forces us to ask a difficult question: can a society's greatest strength, its most brilliant innovation, also become the source of its ultimate fragility when the world it was built for suddenly changes? While the Tiwanaku watched their water vanish, another foundational civilization was slowly poisoned by the very liquid that gave it life. In the fertile crescent of Mesopotamia, the Sumerians and later the Babylonians had mastered their world by taming the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Their intricate networks of canals and dikes transformed the desert into the world's first breadbasket, enabling the rise of cities, writing, and empires. Yet this incredible achievement contained the seeds of its own destruction, a creeping environmental crisis that unfolded over centuries, invisible to the generations it was slowly killing. The culprit was not a drought or a flood, but a toxic residue left behind by the irrigation water itself. Each time water was channeled onto the fields, a portion would evaporate under the intense Mesopotamian sun. This evaporation did not just remove water, it left behind dissolved mineral salts that had been carried in the river water from distant mountains. With every harvest, every growing season, this salt accumulated in the soil year after year, decade after decade. It was a silent, incremental poison. At first, the effects were subtle. The salt-tolerant barley crop began to slowly but surely yield less grain. Then, the more sensitive and highly prized wheat, a staple of the elite diet and a symbol of civilization itself, began to fail entirely in the most affected fields. You can trace this agricultural collapse in ancient cuneiform tablets, which meticulously recorded crop yields. Over time, the records show a stark and chilling trend, a dramatic shift from wheat cultivation to barley, and then a steady, irreversible decline in barley production as well. The land was literally turning against its caretakers. Why was this slow-moving disaster so difficult to stop? The process was simply too gradual for any single ruler or generation to perceive as an existential threat. A slight dip in yield one year would be blamed on poor rains or a pestilence, not on an invisible chemical change in the soil that had been building for 100 years. Furthermore, the technological and social solutions were beyond their reach. Leaching the salts from the soil would have required immense quantities of fresh water for flushing, a luxury they did not have. Letting fields lie fallow for long periods to recover was not an option for a dense, urban population that needed to be fed every single year. The full, long-term impact of this salinization crisis is something archaeologists and soil scientists are still piecing together today. It was not a single event that toppled an empire, but a constant grinding pressure that relentlessly squeezed the agricultural surplus that supported temples, armies, and kings. It forced a shift to less nutritious crops, potentially weakening the population. It may have fueled internal conflicts over the best remaining land and contributed to the vulnerability of Mesopotamian states to outside invaders who came from regions with healthier soil. The great cities of Sumer and Babylon did not disappear overnight because their fields were salty, but their power and resilience were fundamentally eroded, season by season, harvest by harvest. This stands as one of history's most profound and unsettling lessons, a reminder that a civilization's greatest triumph can set in motion a process that ultimately leads to its decay, a quiet catastrophe born not from a failure of technology, but from an inability to foresee the long-term consequences of their own success. The same slow poison that weakened Mesopotamia stands in stark contrast to a civilization shattered by a sudden, violent assault from the skies and sea. On the arid north coast of Peru, the Moche culture built a society of stunning artistic and architectural achievement, only to have it systematically dismantled by a climatic 1-2 punch of almost unimaginable ferocity. Their story is written in the mud of their sacred spaces and the ice at the ends of the earth. Around 600 of the Common Era, the Moche heartland was struck by a mega El Niño event, a climatic monster far beyond the periodic disruptions they were used to. This was not a simple shift in ocean currents, it was a cataclysm. For months, torrential rains that felt biblical in scale would have pounded the coastal desert, a region that normally sees almost no rainfall at all. These rains triggered massive floods pouring down from the Andes and scouring through the valleys. You can visualize the chaos, mud brick palaces and intricate irrigation canals melting away under the deluge, entire communities buried in sludge. The archaeological record confirms this devastation, with layers of sterile silt abruptly covering Moche structures, but the horror was only beginning. Just as the society was reeling from this watery onslaught, the climate pendulum swung to the opposite and far more deadly extreme. The same geological and ice core evidence that reveals the floods also shows a brutal transition into a prolonged drought, one that may have lasted for 30 years or more. The rain simply vanished, the rivers that were once swollen with floodwaters dried up completely, and the sun-baked earth cracked under a relentless sky. This sequence of disasters, a flood followed by a generations-long drought, would have been more than any society could easily withstand. The Moche political and religious system was built on a foundation of control. The ruling lords claimed a direct connection to the gods, an authority that was visibly demonstrated through their ability to manage water and ensure harvest. How could that authority survive when the gods first tried to drown the world and then abandoned it to a perpetual thirst? The massive temples and grand palaces, symbols of their power, would have become monuments to failure. The exact trigger for the final collapse, however, is still debated. Did the environmental shocks cause a sudden, violent uprising against the discredited elite? Or did it lead to a slower fragmentation as different valley communities, their faith in the central authority broken, turned inward and fought each other for the dwindling resources? The evidence is tantalizing but incomplete. We know the Moche world fell apart, but the human drama of its final days remains locked within the ruins, a haunting reminder that a civilization can be engineered to survive many challenges, yet remain utterly vulnerable to the whims of a chaotic climate. The grand citadels of Mycenaean Greece were engineered for war, their massive cyclopean walls built to withstand any siege. Yet these formidable fortresses could not defend against an enemy that came not with swords but from the sky. Around 1200 before the Common Era, the very climate that had sustained the palace economies began to turn against them. Geological evidence from lake beds and cave formations across the eastern Mediterranean paints a stark picture of a world drying out. The rains that fed the olive groves and grain fields grew scarce, initiating a period of severe multi-decadal drought. This was not a single bad year, it was a systemic failure of the weather patterns that underpinned their entire civilization. The centralized palace system, which collected and redistributed agricultural surplus, would have faced an impossible situation. As harvests failed year after year, the storehouses that supplied the armies, the artisans, and the bureaucracy would have emptied. Famine inevitably follows such a profound water shortage, sparking desperation and internal strife. Why remain loyal to a king in a distant palace when he can no longer put food on your table? This environmental stressor did not act alone. The archaeological record reveals another layer of chaos, widespread destruction by fire at many major sites, often accompanied by evidence of violent conflict. This has long been interpreted as evidence of the Dorian invasions, a wave of northern Greek tribes moving into the vacuum. Yet it is equally plausible that these were not invasions from the outside, but internal rebellions and civil wars ignited by the pressures of drought and famine. A population fighting for dwindling resources is far more likely to turn on its own leaders. Compounding this, the region is seismically active, and evidence of earthquake damage at key palaces like Mycenae adds yet another potential trigger for the collapse. So were the Mycenaeans victims of a climatic curse, a seismic catastrophe, or their own internal conflicts? The most compelling answer is that it was all three. The prolonged drought was the match that lit the fuse. It destabilized society, making it vulnerable to the next shock, whether that was an earthquake that shattered its physical infrastructure or a wave of migration that overwhelmed its defenses. The collapse was so total because every pillar of their society gave way at once. The primary cause remains unresolved precisely because it was not a single cause. It was a cascade of failures, a perfect storm where environmental disaster exposed and amplified every existing weakness, plunging Greece into a dark age that would last for centuries. The silence that fell over the great halls of Mycenae and Pylos is a chilling testament to the fact that even the most warlike cultures cannot fight the sky itself. These magnificent cliff dwellings were not just homes, they were fortresses carved into the very rock, and yet their inhabitants chose to walk away from them forever. The ancestral pueblones, once known as the Anasazi, created some of the most iconic structures in the American Southwest, from the vast complex at Choco Canyon to the breathtaking cliff palaces of Mesa Verde. Then, in the 13th century, they orchestrated a complete and methodical exodus, leaving their stone cities silent. The most compelling clue lies in the trees. Scientists studying the annual growth rings of ancient Douglas firs and ponderosa pines have uncovered a terrifying climate story. The data reveals a period of prolonged dryness now known as the Great Drought, a spell of arid conditions that gripped the region for multiple decades, from around 1276 to 1299. For a society whose survival depended entirely on maize agriculture, this was a death sentence. Imagine watching your carefully tended cornfields, the very foundation of your food supply, wither year after year under a merciless sun. The reservoirs and springs they depended on would have dried up, leaving them with no buffer against the relentless aridity. Yet, the timeline of their departure presents a puzzle that the drought alone cannot solve. At some of the major sites, like those in the Mesa Verde region, archaeological evidence suggests that people began leaving in significant numbers before the very worst years of the Great Drought had even begun. This forces us to look beyond a simple story of climate change. Why would a community abandon their secure, generations-old homes before the environmental situation became absolutely desperate? The answer seems to lie in the social fabric which was tearing under the strain. As resources became scarcer, competition for the best farmland and the last reliable water sources would have intensified dramatically. The very design of the later settlements, built high on cliff faces and often accessible only by ladder, suggests a society that was not just hiding from the elements but from other people. This was architecture born of fear. It is possible that internal conflict, perhaps even warfare between different Puebloan groups over dwindling supplies, made life in these once great centers untenable. Religious and political authority may have collapsed as leaders proved unable to call forth the rain. The true mystery of the ancestral Puebloan exodus, therefore, is not whether the environment played a role, but how it interacted with human nature. Was it the drought that caused the conflict, or did pre-existing social tensions simply reach a breaking point when the climate turned against them? The silent, empty kivas and meticulously sealed storage rooms hold their secret close, a testament to a people who made a collective choice to walk away from their stone wonders in search of a new beginning, leaving behind one of the most poignant and unresolved disappearances in the history of North America. Across the sea in Japan, a kingdom was being reforged in the crucible of a changing world. During the Coffin period, powerful chieftains were buried in massive, keyhole-shaped mounds, symbols of a society growing in wealth and centralization. But in the 6th century of the Common Era, this process was violently accelerated by a climate in chaos. Sediment cores pulled from the depths of Japanese lakes tell a story of wild, unpredictable weather. They reveal layers of volcanic ash from multiple major eruptions, one of which was likely from the Haruna volcano, an event that would have cast a long, cold shadow over the islands. This was followed by a dramatic cooling of the climate, a cold snap so severe that historical records from the Korean peninsula and China corroborate the sudden, unseasonable frosts and failed harvest. The consequences were immediate and devastating. Ancient Japanese chronicles like the Nihon Shoki describe years of terrible famine where people starved and the roads were littered with the dead. This was swiftly followed by epidemics, possibly smallpox, which swept through a population already weakened by hunger. The old political order, built on clans claiming descent from divine ancestors, was profoundly shaken. How could the gods allow such suffering? This crisis created a power vacuum, and it is no coincidence that during this very period, we see the rapid importation of new ideas from the Asian mainland, including the complex bureaucratic structures of China and the spiritual framework of Buddhism. The ruling elite, perhaps seeing their traditional spiritual authority crumbling, actively embraced these foreign systems to consolidate a new, more centralized form of government. This is the pivotal mystery, however. While the environmental disasters clearly coincided with this great transformation, drawing a direct line of cause and effect remains incredibly difficult. Was the climate the primary trigger that shattered the old system, forcing a radical reinvention? Or was Japan already on a path toward state formation, with the famines and epidemics merely acting as a catalyst, speeding up a change that was already inevitable? The environmental evidence gives us the backdrop of tragedy, and the historical records show us the political outcome, but the human story in between, the precise moments of decision and desperation that link the two, is a puzzle that the silent coffin mounds refuse to solve. Deep in the heart of the Sahara, a civilization bloomed in a sea of sand. The Garamontes were not primitive nomads, but a sophisticated people who built a powerful kingdom in the Fezzan region of modern-day Libya, a kingdom that commanded a vast network of trade routes across the desert. Their secret was not gold, but a treasure hidden deep beneath their feet: fossil water. This was ancient rainwater trapped in vast underground aquifers for thousands of years, a legacy from a time when the Sahara was green. To tap this life-giving resource, the Garamontes engineered a stunning feat of hydrotechnology, a sprawling system of underground tunnels known as fagaras. These were not simple wells, they were gently sloping channels dug by hand over generations, that used gravity to guide the precious water from the aquifers in the highlands down to the oases and fields in the valleys. This intricate subterranean network, stretching for hundreds of miles, allowed them to create a flourishing agricultural heartland in one of the most inhospitable places on Earth. They grew grapes, figs, and wheat, supporting a population of tens of thousands and a culture rich enough to challenge the Roman Empire. Yet their greatest achievement contained the seed of their eventual downfall. The fossil water they were mining was a finite resource, a bank account with no deposits, only withdrawals. It had taken millennia to accumulate, and the Garamantes were spending it in a geological instant. The mystery that haunts their story is not that their water ran low, but why a society so brilliantly adaptive could not find a way to survive when it did. The decline was likely slow, unfolding over centuries. As the water table dropped, the Fagaras would have begun to run dry, starting with the longest tunnels farthest from the source. Maintaining this vast, hidden infrastructure would have become a constant, draining battle against the shifting sands. You can imagine the slow creep of desperation as once fertile plots of land reverted to desert, forcing communities to contract inward. So why did they not simply develop a new technology or shift their entire economy to rely solely on trade? The answer may lie in the very nature of their success. Their entire society, its wealth, its power, and its identity was built upon the agricultural surplus the Fagaras provided. They were masters of the desert, but they had become prisoners of their own hydrological system. Finding an alternative would have required a radical reinvention of their entire way of life, a shift perhaps as profound as abandoning their cities and returning to a nomadic existence. There is no evidence of a sudden invasion or a catastrophic event that destroyed the Garamantes. Instead, their civilization seems to have simply faded, its lifeblood slowly drained away. Their towns were gradually abandoned and their political power dissolved. The people themselves did not vanish. They were likely absorbed by the Berber tribes that moved into the region, their sophisticated engineering knowledge lost to the desert sands. The story of the Garamantes stands as a powerful and unsettling parable for any civilization that builds its prosperity on a non-renewable resource. It forces us to ask what happens when the well runs dry, not from a sudden catastrophe, but from the slow, quiet exhaustion of the very thing that made you great. The resilience of the northern Maya presents a paradox as profound as the southern collapse. While the great cities of the southern lowlands fell silent, powerful centers in the Yucatan, like Chichen Itza, not only endured but entered a new age of power and influence. This was not a permanent reprieve, however. By the 11th century of the Common Era, even these northern bastions faced their own crisis. The evidence for this later collapse is written in stone and in water, or rather, the lack of it. Sediment cores taken from the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza and from nearby lake beds reveal a chilling story. They show a series of intense, multi-decade droughts that struck the region with devastating force, right around the time the city's monumental construction ceased and its political dominance crumbled. These were not mere dry seasons, they were profound rainfall failures that would have evaporated the very shallow water table the northern Maya depended on, turning their life-giving cenotes into nearly unreachable pits. The social consequences would have been catastrophic. A city like Chichen Itza, which thrived on its ability to control water resources and exact tribute from a vast network of subordinate sites, would have seen its authority evaporate as quickly as the water in its reservoirs. Famine, followed by political fragmentation and internal conflict, would have been almost inevitable, yet here lies the core of the mystery. If drought was the ultimate cause, why was the collapse in the north not final? Why did another powerful city, Mayapan, rise just a few generations later to forge a new regional state, only to itself collapse in a civil war centuries after that? This cycle of collapse and rebirth suggests the environmental disaster was not an absolute ending. The droughts of the 11th century were severe, but they were not a permanent, irreversible change in the climate. The rains eventually returned. The real puzzle then is not just about climate, but about social and political adaptation. Why could Chichen Itza not weather the drought, while Mayapan could later build a new league on seemingly the same landscape? The answer may lie in the different ways these societies were organized. Chichen Itza's power may have been more rigid, its control more absolute, making it brittle when the central resource of water failed. Mayapan's later federation, by contrast, might have been a more flexible and decentralized response to the same environmental pressures, a lesson hard learned from the earlier collapse. The unresolved question for archaeologists is whether the later rise of Mayapan was a direct result of the environmental shock that felled Chichen Itza, a societal evolution forced by climate, or if it was simply the next chapter in a long cycle of Maya political life, temporarily interrupted by a bad stretch of weather. The story of the Northern Maya is a vital reminder that an environmental disaster is never just a single event. It is a complex dialogue between a changing world and the human capacity to change with it. The Kingdom of Meroe was a powerhouse of iron and trade, its wealth forged in the heat of countless furnaces. For centuries, this Nubian kingdom in what is now Sudan stood as a brilliant rival to Ptolemaic and Roman Egypt, a center of industry and culture. Yet by the middle of the 4th century of the Common Era, its power had faded, its great pyramids standing as lonely sentinels in an advancing desert. The cause of its decline presents a classic archaeological dilemma, a tangled knot of environmental strain and external threat. To fuel their prolific iron production, the Meroites needed a constant, massive supply of charcoal. This required cutting down vast tracts of the already sparse acacia forests that held the fragile soil in place. At the same time, their growing herds of cattle and goats would have overgrazed the grasslands, stripping away the protective vegetation. This 1-2 punch of deforestation and overgrazing is a recipe for desertification, a process where fertile land permanently dries out and turns to desert. You can visualize the slow, creeping crisis, the topsoil, no longer anchored by roots, simply blowing away with each dry season wind. Their agricultural base would have shrunk just as their population and industrial demands were at their peak. But was this self-inflicted environmental damage the main story? Just as Meroe was weakening, a new power was rising in the east, the Kingdom of Aksum in the Ethiopian highlands. Aksumite military campaigns pressed inward, and historical records tell of a king who boasted of burning Meroe's towns. So which was the true killer, the slow internal decay of the land, or the sharp external shock of a rival empire's army? The environmental theory suggests that the desertification had already crippled Meroe's economy, making it a hollow shell vulnerable to any external push. A kingdom that cannot feed itself or fuel its forges cannot field an effective army for long. The military theory, however, argues that Aksumite aggression was the decisive, final blow that shattered a state which might have otherwise adapted or recovered. The truth is likely found in the deadly synergy between the two. A resource-starved Meroe was easy pickings for Aksum, and the conflict with Aksum would have made it impossible to implement any large-scale, long-term solutions to the environmental crisis, like reforestation or land management. The people of Meroe did not vanish, but their political unity and industrial might did, leaving behind a haunting question for our own world. Can any civilization, no matter how industrious, outrun the consequences of consuming the very land that gives it life? That great river, the Gaga Hakra, did not just shift its course on a whim. It was starved from above. The lifeblood of the Indus Valley civilization was the Indian summer monsoon, an annual atmospheric river that carried rain from the ocean to the plains. But around 4,200 years ago, this vital system began to falter. Paleoclimatologists have uncovered startling evidence from ocean sediment cores and cave formations, geological diaries that record climate patterns over millennia. These records point to a dramatic weakening of the monsoon around 2200 before the Common Era. the rains that had reliably filled the river and soaked the fields for generations simply grew weaker and less frequent. This was not a single failed season, but a profound, long-term climate anomaly that would have fundamentally reshaped the landscape. The mighty Gaga Hakra, dependent on monsoon-fed streams from the foothills, would have shrunk from a perennial, powerful river into a seasonal trickle, and then into a string of isolated pools in a wide, sandy bed. The debate among scientists today is not whether this happened, but how it happened. Was this monsoon failure a sudden, catastrophic event, a climatic cliff that the Harappans fell off in a matter of decades? Or was it a slow, creeping desiccation that unfolded over centuries, a gradual tightening of a noose that the civilization barely perceived until it was too late? The distinction is everything. A sudden collapse would have been apocalyptic, causing immediate crop failure and triggering a rapid, panicked abandonment of cities. A gradual decline, however, presents a more complex and haunting scenario. In this version, the Harappans would have fought back with all their engineering genius. They would have dug their wells deeper and extended their irrigation canals further, managing the crisis year by year. But each adaptation would have been more difficult and costly than the last, slowly draining their social and economic reserves. Their society, so brilliantly organized, might have simply worn down, its unity fragmenting as each city or region was forced to fend for itself in a world where the central resource, water, was steadily disappearing. The unresolved question is one of human resilience against a changing sky. Could a civilization as advanced and adaptable as the Harappans have survived a slower, more persistent drought? Or was the monsoon shift, whether swift or gradual, simply too powerful a force for any Bronze Age society to withstand? The silent, sprawling ruins of their cities suggest that even the most sophisticated urban planning is no match for a sky that refuses to rain. Even a golden age can cast a long and dangerous shadow. The Roman warm period provided the Mediterranean world with centuries of stable, warm, and wet climate, an environmental gift that fueled the empire's rise. Abundant harvests from Gaul to Egypt filled the granaries, supporting the vast legions and the sprawling urban populations of cities like Rome itself. This was a time of prosperity built on a predictable and generous climate. Yet this very stability created a paradox, a hidden fragility that would only reveal itself later. The same warm conditions that blessed the empire's heartland appear to have triggered severe droughts in its North African provinces, the very breadbasket that supplied Rome with so much of its grain. The Nile River, Egypt's eternal lifeline, also seems to have experienced less reliable flooding during this era. Its annual inundation, which deposited the rich silt that fertilized the fields, became more erratic, sometimes failing to reach the necessary height to water all the crops. You can picture the tension in this system, the core of the empire growing fat and dependent on a network of provinces that were themselves beginning to strain under climatic pressures they did not create. The unresolved question that fascinates historians and climatologists today is not whether the Roman warm period helped the empire, but how its mixed effects contributed to a slow burn crisis. Did the prosperity of the core blind the Romans to the environmental degradation happening at the edges? The empire's immense population and its insatiable demand for resources, from North African grain to British timber, may have pushed regional ecosystems past their breaking point, all while the pleasant climate in Italy masked the growing danger. This presents a haunting lesson about the illusion of a permanent golden age. How could a civilization so adept at engineering and administration fail to see that its greatest strength, a favorable climate, was also creating the conditions for its future vulnerability? The Roman warm period did not cause the fall of the empire, but it may have set the stage, making the entire colossal structure more brittle and less able to withstand the political shocks and climate shifts that were to come in the centuries that followed. A thick layer of ash buried entire coastlines, a stark grey line in the soil that marks one of the most violent events in human history. Around 6,300 years before the Common Era, the Kikai caldera, a massive volcano off the southern coast of Japan, exploded in a super eruption that ranks among the largest of the last 10,000 years. The scale is almost incomprehensible, ejecting hundreds of cubic kilometers of rock and ash into the atmosphere and collapsing the volcano into a vast undersea caldera. For the Jaman people, a sophisticated and stable hunter-gatherer, fisher culture that had flourished for millennia, this was an apocalypse falling directly from the sky. The immediate aftermath would have been a world plunged into a deep volcanic winter. The sun would have been blotted out for years by a global shroud of reflective sulfate aerosols, causing temperatures to plummet across the northern hemisphere. Summers would have failed and frosts would have occurred even in the warmest months, devastating the rich nut and plant resources the Jaman relied upon. The ocean, their other great provider, would have suffered equally, with the ash fall and chemical changes poisoning coastal waters and destroying the marine life that sustained their communities. The archaeological record confirms this cataclysm, with a clear and sudden break in pottery styles and settlement patterns across a wide area, a silent testimony to a society thrown into chaos. Yet here is where the mystery takes hold. After this initial disruption, the evidence becomes far more complex and intriguing. Within a few generations, the Jaman culture did not simply vanish, it demonstrated a breathtaking resilience. They adapted their technologies, creating new, more regionally distinct styles of pottery. They shifted their subsistence strategies, perhaps relying more on hardy, cold-tolerant resources. Some groups may have migrated away from the most affected zones, while others found ways to endure in place. This presents a profound puzzle for archaeologists. How did a prehistoric society, without any metal tools or centralized government, manage to survive a climatic shock of this magnitude when so many later, more complex empires would later fall to similar events? The answer may lie in their very structure. The Jaman were not a centralized, densely populated state. They were a flexible network of semi-sedentary communities, diversified in their food sources and not dependent on a single crop or a rigid hierarchy. This lack of complexity may have been their greatest strength, allowing them to adapt and reorganize without the total systemic collapse that would beset an empire. The enduring enigma of the Jaman is not whether they suffered, but why they ultimately endured, a testament to human resilience in the face of a planet's raw fury. The great citadels of the Oxus civilization stood as islands of wealth in a desert sea. Known to archaeologists as the Bactria Margiana archaeological complex, this society built fortified centers with towering walls and intricate ritual complexes, dominating the trade routes of Central Asia. Their artisans crafted magnificent silver and gold vessels, and their influence stretched from the Iranian plateau to the Indus Valley. Then, around 1800 before the Common Era, their world fell silent. The bustling centers were abandoned, their grand gates left open to the encroaching sands. The mystery of their disappearance is tied directly to the lifeblood of their existence, the rivers that fed their oasis settlements. The Amu Darya, known in antiquity as the Oxus River, was the artery of this civilization, its waters channeled through elaborate irrigation canals to create fertile green belts in an otherwise arid landscape. A leading theory suggests that the river began to shift its course dramatically, possibly due to tectonic activity deep beneath the earth. Such a geological event could have forced the river onto a new path, stranding the settlements that depended on it. You can picture the slow, creeping disaster as the canals that once brimmed with water gradually ran dry, the fields turning to dust and the date palms withering under the relentless sun. Without this constant supply of fresh water, the agricultural surplus that supported the elite, the artisans, and the soldiers simply vanished. The very reason for these cities to exist, their strategic position on trade routes, would have become meaningless if there was no food to sustain the merchants and the population. Why did they not simply follow the river? The answer may lie in the sheer scale of the shift and the fixed nature of their investment. Their monumental architecture, their fortified walls, and their intricate canal systems were all permanent fixtures. They could not simply pick up and move a city built of mud, brick, and stone. The social and political structure that held them together was rooted in those specific places. As the water failed, that structure would have fractured, leading to internal conflict or a gradual dispersal of the population back into smaller, more mobile pastoral groups. Yet the exact environmental trigger remains frustratingly out of reach for scientists. The region encompassing modern Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Afghanistan is politically complex, making large-scale archaeological and geological surveys difficult and sometimes dangerous to conduct. Researchers cannot easily drill deep sediment cores across a wide area to trace the ancient river channels or confirm evidence of major earthquakes. This lack of access leaves a critical gap in the story. Was it one catastrophic tectonic event that suddenly stole their river? Or was it a slower process of siltation and climate change that gradually made their oasis life untenable? The silent, sand-buried fortresses of the Oxus civilization hold a vital clue to how a culture of immense sophistication can be undone by a wandering river, a mystery locked away in one of the world's most elusive landscapes. The same creeping sands that swallowed the Garamantes also threatened one of Rome's greatest rivals. The Parthian Empire ruled a vast domain stretching from the Euphrates to the Indus, controlling the lucrative Silk Road and fielding armies of heavily armored cavalry that could shatter a Roman legion. Yet this formidable power began to falter from within, its heartland slowly consumed by an enemy no cavalry charge could defeat. For centuries, the intensive agriculture needed to feed its cities, and the relentless grazing of countless herds of goats and sheep stripped the fragile landscape of its protective vegetation. The soil, no longer anchored by roots, simply blew away with each seasonal wind, leaving behind a barren, sun-baked crust. This process of desertification was a slow-moving catastrophe, invisible to any single generation but relentless in its progress. You can visualize the advancing front of sand dunes year by year, swallowing fields that had fed families for generations and burying irrigation canals under suffocating drifts. The empire's agricultural base, particularly in its crucial Mesopotamian breadbasket, was being systematically erased. The challenge for modern historians is untangling this environmental decay from the more dramatic story of Parthia's endless wars with Rome. The historical record is filled with epic battles and shifting borders, the clash of empires that seems to explain everything. But was the constant warfare a cause of Parthia's decline, or was it a symptom of a deeper internal weakness? A state whose farmlands are turning to desert is a state with a shrinking tax base, a weakened ability to supply its armies, and a growing population of desperate, displaced farmers. Such a society becomes brittle, far less able to withstand the shock of an external invasion or to fund a prolonged campaign. Did the desertification create the conditions that made Parthia vulnerable to Roman pressure, or did the demands of perpetual war force the overexploitation of the land that led to its ruin? It is the classic historical dilemma, a feedback loop of cause and effect. The sand did not care about the legions at the gates. It advanced with a quiet, insistent pressure that ultimately may have done more to hollow out the Parthian Empire than any foreign enemy ever could. High in the arid valleys of coastal Peru, the Caral Soup civilization built a world of pyramids and plazas while the Great Pyramids of Egypt were still young. This was the oldest known civilization in the Americas, a sophisticated society that flourished for centuries in harmony with a landscape it understood intimately. Yet around 1800 before the Common Era, their magnificent cities were systematically abandoned, leaving their monumental architecture to the desert wind. The clues to their collapse are not found in weapons or invasion, but in the cracked earth and broken stones of their sacred spaces. Archaeologists have uncovered startling evidence at sites like Carol itself, where massive stone structures show clear signs of being shattered by immense seismic force. The ground here did not merely tremble, it convulsed in a massive earthquake, one powerful enough to topple temples and rupture the very foundations of their society. This geological catastrophe was followed by an even more insidious enemy, a prolonged and severe drought that gripped the region for generations. The evidence for this climatic shift is locked in the surrounding hills, where sediment layers reveal a long period of extreme aridity beginning right at the time of the civilization's decline. You can visualize the desperation of a people whose world was breaking in two different ways at once. First, the earth itself betrayed them, shaking their grandest achievements into rubble. Then the skies offered no reprieve, withholding the rains season after season, starving the fields that fed the population and the cotton crops that fueled their trade networks. This environmental one-two punch raises a haunting question: why could such an innovative and long-lasting society not recover? The Carol Soup people were master engineers, capable of designing complex irrigation systems and constructing enormous pyramidal mounds. Their resilience should have been considerable. The mystery may lie in the psychological and spiritual impact of the dual disaster. Their society was deeply religious, with a cosmology intricately tied to the natural world and the earth itself. A catastrophic earthquake would not just be a physical blow, it would be a divine rejection, a shattering of their covenant with the gods. When the expected rains then failed to come, their entire belief system, the source of their leaders' authority and social cohesion, may have collapsed along with their buildings. The ultimate fate of the Carol Soup people remains one of archaeology's quietest enigmas. They did not vanish in a violent conquest, they simply walked away, dispersing into smaller groups and leaving their stone cities as silent monuments. This suggests a profound loss of faith, a collective decision that the gods had abandoned this place, making it impossible to rebuild. The unresolved puzzle is whether a single disaster, the quake or the drought alone, might have been survivable, but the combination proved too devastating for the human spirit to bear. Even a kingdom forged in highland isolation could not escape the reach of a changing world. The kingdom of Axum, a powerhouse that once minted its own coins and commanded trade from the Mediterranean to India, saw its influence wane dramatically after the 7th century. Its monumental stelae, towering obelisks that proclaimed its greatness, stood as silent sentinels over a declining realm. The causes of this fade into obscurity are deeply entangled with the very land that gave it life. For centuries, Axum's prosperity was built on intensive agriculture across the Ethiopian highlands. To feed a growing population and supply its bustling port on the Red Sea, farmers cleared vast tracts of indigenous forest for fields and to obtain timber for construction and fuel. This relentless clearing, combined with the seasonal rains pounding the exposed slopes, triggered widespread soil erosion. The rich, dark topsoil that had nurtured their crops for generations slowly washed away, sliding down the hillsides and silting up the rivers, leaving behind increasingly barren and less productive land. You can visualize the slow creep of exhaustion across the landscape, each harvest yielding a little less than the one before. This environmental degradation would have struck at the heart of the Axumite economy, steadily reducing the agricultural surplus that supported the elite, the army, and the complex state machinery. Yet, just as this internal crisis was unfolding, an external revolution was reshaping the world. The rapid rise and expansion of Islamic powers in the 7th century fundamentally redirected global trade. The old maritime routes through the Red Sea, which Axum had dominated, became less critical as new overland and alternative sea routes, controlled by Muslim caliphates, gained prominence. Axum found itself pushed from the center of the economic world to its periphery, losing the vital trade revenues that had filled its coffers. So which was the true architect of Axum's decline, the slow death of its soil or the sudden shift in global commerce? This is the core of the historical debate. The environmental theory suggests that the kingdom was already hollowed out, its economic base crumbling from within, making it acutely vulnerable to any external shock. A state that cannot feed itself robustly is in a poor position to adapt to new economic realities. The trade theory, however, posits that the loss of their commercial lifeblood was the decisive blow, a catastrophic event that no amount of agricultural resilience could have overcome. The most likely truth is a devastating synergy. A resource-weakened Axum lacked the economic flexibility to pivot when its trade networks collapsed. It could not easily fund new ventures or reinforce its military to secure alternative resources. The people of Axum did not vanish, but their political unity and international prestige did, leaving behind a haunting question about the limits of power. Can any empire, no matter how brilliantly it adapts to its own highlands, survive when the very ground beneath its feet begins to slip away and the trade winds that once enriched it suddenly change direction? Fire was not an end, but a recurring ritual for one of Europe's oldest civilizations. Across the fertile plains of what is now Romania, Moldova, and Ukraine, the Cucuteni Tripilia culture built some of the largest settlements on Earth in the Neolithic era, vast proto-cities that could house thousands of people. Their communities thrived for nearly 2,000 years, a testament to their agricultural skill and social organization. Yet their story is marked by a bizarre and consistent pattern. Roughly every 60 to 80 years, these massive towns were not simply abandoned, they were systematically set ablaze. The evidence is etched into the ground, thick layers of ash and fired clay that show entire districts were consumed in carefully managed conflagrations. This was not the chaos of an enemy attack, but a deliberate community-wide act. So why would a society repeatedly destroy its own architectural marvels? The environmental theory points to a slow, creeping crisis. Their intensive farming practices, focused on wheat and barley, may have gradually depleted the soil of essential nutrients over a few generations. As crop yields began to fall, the land itself would have signaled that it was time to move on. Burning the settlement could have been a practical solution, a way to sanitize the site, kill pests, and release a burst of nutrients from the ash back into the earth for the next cycle of use. But could soil exhaustion alone explain such a dramatic, ceremonial act of destruction? This leads to a more profound spiritual explanation. Perhaps the burning was a great purification rite, a symbolic death and rebirth of the entire community. In this view, the life of a village, like the life of a person, had a predetermined span. After 60 or 80 years, the accumulated spiritual weight, the memories and conflicts embedded in the very walls of the houses, required a cleansing by fire. This ritual destruction would have reinforced social bonds, allowing the community to collectively rebuild from a clean slate, both physically and spiritually, in a new location nearby. The true mystery is not that they burned their towns, but that they maintained this extraordinary cycle for centuries. How did they coordinate such a massive undertaking? What beliefs were so powerful that they justified the immense labor of rebuilding their world from scratch over and over again? The puzzle of the Cucuteni Tripilia burnings remains one of prehistory's most enigmatic, a choice that looks like collapse but may have been the very secret to their astonishing longevity. The vast Pacific Ocean was not a barrier to the Lapita people, but a highway. With their iconic pottery and unparalleled seafaring skills, the island hopped across thousands of miles of open water, settling remote islands from New Guinea to Samoa in one of humanity's most audacious migrations. Then, around 500 years before the Common Era, this relentless eastward push simply stopped. For centuries, the ocean beyond Samoa remained a mystery to them, a void their advanced canoes did not cross. What could possibly make a people who had conquered the greatest ocean on Earth suddenly decide they had gone far enough? the clues point to the ocean itself turning against them. Scientists analyzing coral cores from the region have found evidence that this era coincided with a period of intense and volatile activity in the El Niño Southern Oscillation. This was not just a typical El Niño cycle, but a sustained period of climatic chaos. The normal patterns of winds and currents that the Lapita navigators relied upon as their maritime roadmap would have become dangerously unpredictable. Gentle trade winds that normally pushed them eastward could have reversed into fierce westerly headwinds. Calm seas could have erupted into sudden, monstrous storms. For a culture navigating by the stars, waves, and bird flights, this would have been like the rules of the world being rewritten. A voyage that was once a calculated risk would have become a near-certain death sentence. The mystery that endures is not just the environmental shift, but the human response to it. Why did the pause last for so many generations? Was the knowledge of how to sail east simply lost over time? Or was it a conscious cultural decision, a taboo born from too many canoes failing to return? Perhaps the islands they already occupied provided enough resources, reducing the pressure to venture further into a demonstrably hostile sea. The Lapita pause is a unique kind of disaster, one defined not by a single catastrophic event, but by a closing door of opportunity. It is a haunting reminder that even the most brilliant explorers are ultimately bound by the limits of their environment, and that sometimes the greatest mystery is not why a civilization fell, but why it chose to stop. The endless sea of grass that sustained the Xiongnu Confederation began to turn against them. Paleoclimatologists have uncovered a chilling story from the sediment cores of Mongolian lakes, revealing periods of extreme and prolonged drought that gripped the Eurasian steppe. For a people whose entire existence, wealth, and power were bound to their herds of horses, sheep, and cattle, this was an existential crisis. The grasslands that were their pasture and their pantry simply withered, leading to catastrophic livestock die-offs. A nomad without his herd is a king without a kingdom, stripped of his mobility, his food, and the very foundation of his social status. You can almost feel the desperation, watching the animals that were your lifeblood grow weaker with each passing season, until nothing remained but bones and dust. This environmental pressure created a powerful impetus for movement, for raiding, and for consolidation under strong leaders who could promise survival. The Confederation likely grew tighter and more aggressive as a direct response to this scarcity, turning their coordinated cavalry against a familiar target, the settled and wealthy civilizations of China. Their infamous conflicts with the Han Dynasty, which led to the construction of the early Great Wall, can be seen through this lens. A desperate people, pushed from their ancestral lands by a changing climate, will inevitably push against their neighbors. Yet, drawing a straight line from drought to historical conflict is a dangerous oversimplification. The archaeological record of the Xiongnu is notoriously sparse. How do you trace the movements of a people who built their empire not from stone, but from felt and leather, who left behind no great cities, only fleeting campsites and burial mounds? The evidence is fragmented and open to interpretation. Was it purely the drought that forced them to become a martial confederation, or were complex political ambitions and internal social dynamics just as important? The Chinese historical records written by their adversaries naturally portray the Xiongnu as ruthless barbarians, a narrative that conveniently ignores the environmental catastrophe that may have been driving them. The true mystery of the Xiongnu is not that they clashed with China, but untangling the web of motivation. How much of their history was dictated by the failing grass, and how much by the ambitions of their chieftains? The silent, windswept steppe holds the answer, a reminder that the rise and fall of empires is often written in the soil long before it is ever written in stone. The final mystery lies preserved in the sand, a riddle of life and death in one of the most unforgiving places on Earth. The Tarim Basin mummies were discovered in the heart of western China's Taklamakan Desert, a hyper-arid sea of shifting dunes where survival today seems almost impossible. Yet these are not the remains of recent travelers lost in the sand. They are Bronze Age individuals dating back as far as 4,000 years, and their existence there is a profound paradox. Their bodies, naturally mummified by the extreme dryness and salt of the desert, are strikingly well preserved, and they possess features that are distinctly European, with tall frames, long noses, and light-colored hair. They were not just passing through, they established settled communities in a landscape that is now utterly barren. The settlements they built, like the site of Zyro, were positioned along ancient river channels that have long since vanished. These people herded cattle and sheep, wove sophisticated textiles from wool, and buried their dead in boat-shaped coffins, a practice that suggests a deep cultural connection to water. Their entire way of life points to a world that was once green, a network of grasslands and reliable waterways that sustained them for centuries. So what environmental cataclysm could have transformed their fertile homeland into the deadly desert we see today? The process of desertification is the prime suspect, but its exact mechanism and timing remain hotly debated. One leading theory suggests that the rivers that fed their oases began to shift their courses, a common occurrence in such flat, sandy basins. As the main channels wandered, the smaller tributaries that supplied their settlements would have dried up, turning the surrounding pastures to dust. Another, more dramatic possibility is that the region was gripped by a prolonged megadrought, part of a larger climatic shift that starved the entire area of rainfall for generations. The grasslands, once sustained by seasonal rains and river overflow, would have withered and died, their root systems no longer able to hold the soil against the relentless wind. You can almost feel the slow, creeping dread as the wells ran dry and the familiar grazing lands disappeared under advancing dunes. The communities would have faced an impossible choice: stay and starve, or abandon the homes of their ancestors and embark into the unknown in search of water. They chose to leave, and the desert moved in, sealing their world under a blanket of sand for millennia. The enduring enigma is not just that the climate changed, but the specific sequence of events that made it so irreversible. Was it a sudden, catastrophic drought that delivered a final blow, or a slower, more insidious process where each generation had slightly less water than the one before, until one day there was simply none left? The mummies themselves offer no clear answer, their silent, preserved faces holding the secret of the world they lost. They stand as a haunting final testament to the power of a changing environment, a civilization that did not fall to war or invasion, but was simply and utterly reclaimed by the desert. From the silent mummies of the Thera Basin to the scorched cities of the Bronze Age, these 30 mysteries share a chillingly familiar pattern. Across continents and millennia, the most common thread woven through these ancient collapses is not war or invasion, but a fragile relationship with the natural world. Time and again, we see civilizations brought low by a trifecta of pressures: a changing climate that delivered either devastating drought or catastrophic floods, the relentless depletion of vital resources like fresh water and fertile soil, and a societal rigidity that prevented adaptation when it mattered most. These were not simple failures, they were complex breakdowns where environmental shock exposed and amplified every hidden vulnerability. The haunting truth these ruins whisper is that no amount of military might or architectural genius can ultimately protect a society from a fundamental breakdown in its relationship with its environment. The very innovations that allowed these cultures to flourish, from the intricate canals of Angkor to the fagaras of the Garamontes, often became traps when the climate shifted. These stories are unresolved because they force us to confront an uncomfortable question about our own place in the world. We now live in an era of accelerated climate change, facing our own versions of megadroughts, rising seas, and resource scarcity. The lessons from these ancient disasters are not merely historical curiosities, they are a stark warning. They teach us about the danger of short-term thinking, the fragility of centralized systems, and the absolute necessity of building resilient and flexible societies. The past shows us that civilizations are not eternal, and their survival may hinge on their ability to listen to the environment and change course. We have the unique advantage of being able to read this warning, written in the dust of 30 fallen worlds. The greatest mystery of all may be whether we will choose to learn from them. We would love to hear which of these ancient disasters you find most compelling, so please share your thoughts in the comments below. The ruins of these ancient worlds are not just relics, they are a mirror. The same environmental pressures that fractured the Bronze Age and starved the Maya are unfolding on a global scale today. Our modern megadroughts in the American West and the Mediterranean are eerily similar to the centuries-long dry spells that turned Akkadian fields to dust. The sea level rise threatening our coastal cities echoes the slow, inexorable drowning of the Indus Valley shoreline, and our relentless consumption of finite resources, from fossil water in aquifers to the fertile topsoil we are eroding at an alarming rate, is a direct parallel to the Garamontes mining their ancient aquifers or the Parthians watching their farmlands turn to desert. We are reenacting the same patterns of strain and depletion, just on a planetary stage. The critical difference, however, is one of knowledge. For the ancients, these disasters were mysterious acts of angry gods or inexplicable forces of nature. Their collapses remain unexplained because they lack the science to see the chain of causality. We have no such excuse. Our satellites map the retreating ice sheets in real time. Our climate models project the intensifying storms and the shifting rainfall patterns with terrifying accuracy. We can read the warning signs in the atmosphere and in the acidifying oceans. The mystery for our civilization, then, is not what is happening, but how we will respond. Will we be remembered as the society that had all the data, that understood the precise mechanics of its own potential collapse and yet chose to do nothing? Or will we learn the ultimate lesson from 30 fallen worlds and forge a new, more resilient path? The choice we make will write the final, unanswered chapter in this long story of civilizations and their environment.